In the far northeast. Another breezy day, and so that means on exposed east coast it's going to be cooler, 12 or 13 degrees, but with some sunshine coming through. Again, 18 degrees is not out of the question. More of the same as we go into the second half of the weekend. All the weather action is moving its way through France, across the Alps and into Germany. Plenty of isobars on the chart further north, so another windy affair, a northeasterly wind, but that should hopefully help to break up the cloud. More sunshine coming through, with the exception of the far northeast, and so once again, we could see highs of 18 degrees. Enjoy.
Tonight at 10, more claims of war crimes in Ukraine, as the UN says the situation is a horror story for civilians. It comes as Russian forces are accused of mass killings in the besieged port city of Mariupol.
They killed 20,000 people. They did it on purpose, this is what I think. They intentionally prevented people from leaving Mariupol.
Russia's President Putin accuses the Ukrainian government of not letting troops surrender, also tonight. In India, Boris Johnson vows to deepen trade ties with the post-Brexit deal by October. A 45-year-old German man is understood to have been declared an official suspect in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. It's the final stretch in a tight French presidential race for Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron. And art in the shadow of war, the Ukrainian entries at the Venice Biennale.
Coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, Tyson Fury weighs in nearly a stone lighter than usual for his heavyweight title defence against Dillian Whyte at Wembley tomorrow.
Good evening. The United Nations has described the war in Ukraine as a horror story of violations against civilians and says there's growing evidence war crimes may have been committed. Near the besieged southern port city of Mariupol, US satellite images appear to show a mass burial site containing around 200 graves. Russian forces have been trying to fully capture the city for several weeks. They do control most of the area, but hundreds of Ukrainian troops are still hiding out in the sprawling Azovstal steel plant. Today, President Putin accused Ukrainian leaders of refusing to allow their soldiers to surrender. Our correspondent Catherine Biorahanga has more from southern Ukraine.
Haunting, apocalyptic scenes in Mariupol. Russia has bombarded this city into near submission. Once home to about 500,000 people, thousands are believed to have been killed. Emergency workers from Russia are filmed here retrieving the dead. Moscow has repeatedly denied that its troops are responsible for the mass killings of civilians in Ukraine. But Mariupol's mayor says some of the worst war crimes have been committed there.
They killed 20,000 people. They did it on purpose, this is what I think. They intentionally prevented people from leaving Mariupol. They set this genocide up by closing the city down and using land artillery and airstrikes first, and then the warships that arrived later.
Russian forces have been accused of hiding civilian bodies in mass graves. These satellite images show them appearing over the course of a month. The civilians have been buried in the village of Manhush, outside Mariupol, the southern city which has been besieged and encircled by Russian forces for weeks. The last Ukrainian troops in the city are holed up inside the Azovstal steelworks on Mariupol's coast. 1,000 civilians are still said to be in this sprawling industrial complex. On this missing persons wall, most of the faces and names that you can see are people from Mariupol. And now with the ongoing blockade and with communications cut off, it's almost a miracle for people to get out. Katerina, Valentina and Nadezhda escaped Mariupol together on Thursday. Just a handful of people who made it through with a humanitarian convoy. A friendship born out of the horrors of this war.
People are risking their lives under fire. They have to because there's no running water, gas, or electricity. There's a mosque in the Primorsky district with a well nearby. A lot of people got killed there. They got caught up in shelling. They were just looking for water in the city.
But they're safe now and able to rebuild their lives in new cities and countries. Catherine Biarahanga, BBC News, Zaporizhia.
Boris Johnson says there's a realistic possibility the war in Ukraine could continue until the end of next year. But speaking on a visit to India, he insisted Vladimir Putin wouldn't succeed in trying to grind the Ukrainians down. Miles of defensive trenches have been dug around the capital Kyiv as a precaution should Russian troops return, with life now less precarious after the city was successfully defended a few weeks ago. Our correspondent Mark Lowen has been spending time with Ukrainian troops in the capital.
For the defenders of Kyiv, the battle isn't over. This time it's training, but while the enemy has retreated to the east, the danger still looms. Vlad Nekrutenko was a PhD law student until the Russians tried and failed to seize his city.
Do you think it is possible that they could come back?
Let's say we lose our positions on Donbass or Lugansk region, and then they see that we don't have enough troops and resources to protect Kyiv. They would come back for their initial aim to take over our capital and take over our government.
In the forests of Kyiv, we can't disclose where, the 131st Battalion is dug in, a crucial line of defence for the capital.
How many kilometres or how many of the trenches?
10 kilometres, 20 kilometres, I don't know.
Great Britain sent us this weapon.
So there's anti-tank missiles from Britain?
Yes.
And when was the last time that you used this weapon here?
Secret. The
Russians were 3 or 4 kilometers from us, firing with mortars and artillery. If they return, without our resistance, they could storm through. And they will make an effort to do so again. But I think the residents of Kiev can sleep more soundly, knowing that we are here.
A whole infrastructure is in place. Spots where Kiev families would picnic now have new dwellers.
Soup.
It still feels astonishing to see how a modern European capital has suddenly been taken back to the trench-filled warfare of decades ago. And they're in this for the long haul because they now know that the threat to the very existence of their country will continue.
For those dug in, reminders of the life they left behind 2 months ago, when Russia thought it could barge into Kiev with little resistance, and when Ukraine's residents became its protectors. Mark Lowen, BBC News, Kyiv.
Well, our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams is here. Well over 50 days so far of this conflict. What might success look like for either the Ukrainians or Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think for Russia, Clive, clearly success is being redefined almost every day. The invasion was premised on a quick assault on the capital, the removal of the Zelensky government and the installation of a puppet regime. That didn't work, so the focus shifted to the Donbass, extending those areas held by pro-Russian separatists in the east and securing that land corridor from the Donbass to Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. And that's why, of course, Mariupol is so important. But you still do get glimpses of wider ambitions. You had a Russian general just today talking about seizing all of southern Ukraine, creating an even longer corridor to another pro-Russian separatist area, Transnistria in Moldova. Now that would involve completely cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea. I think given Russia's setback so far, that seems like a rather distant prospect. But Western officials do warn that if the assault on the Donbass goes well for Vladimir Putin, he might well start to think big again. For Ukraine, well, just repelling Russia's advances and stopping them taking more territory is the #1 priority. But if they do manage to do that, and the West is hurling new and heavier weaponry into Ukraine, speeding that up, then Ukraine may sense an opportunity to roll back those Russian advances back to where we were on February the 24th. That would be a spectacular success for Ukraine, but it would involve retaking an awful lot of territory.
Okay. Paul, many thanks. Paul Adams there. Boris Johnson says he still expects to be Prime Minister by the time the UK hopes to sign a new trade deal with India in October. He was speaking on his visit to New Delhi after talks with the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Mr Johnson is facing a Commons investigation into whether he misled MPs over what he knew about lockdown parties at Number 10. Our political correspondent Ben Wright has more from New Delhi.
The sun shone, the soldiers saluted, and the ceremony never flagged. It was the red carpet treatment for Boris Johnson, who was here for talks with his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi. After yesterday's torrid day of political turmoil at home, Mr Johnson seemed pleased to bask in the welcome.
Joyful reception. I wouldn't get that necessarily everywhere.
This is when the visit got down to business. It's 75 years since India gained independence from Britain, and both countries say a free trade deal can be signed this year to mark the moment.
Next week, we're telling our negotiators, get it done by Diwali in October.
They had a long discussion about Ukraine. India has held a neutral position on Russia's invasion, and Boris Johnson did not come here to jab or pressure, but Mr Modi did call for peace.
We emphasised on an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine and on the use of dialogue and diplomacy for resolving issues.
While Boris Johnson later confirmed the UK intended to deepen its military commitment to the crisis.
So we're looking at sending tanks to Poland.
That's to allow Warsaw to send its tanks to Ukraine. And the Prime Minister also said British diplomats would soon be returning to the capital.
I can announce today that we will very shortly, next week, reopen our embassy in Ukraine's capital city.
It's been a difficult couple of days for the Prime Minister, who's now facing an inquiry by MPs into whether he misled Parliament. You said there'll be a free trade agreement with India by Diwali, but considering the number of party investigations going on back home, are you absolutely sure you'll still be Prime Minister then?
OK, the second answer is yes, but on the... all trade agreements are tricky, Ben, to get to your point about trade, but and there will be tough asks of both sides, but I'm sure we can do it.
Boris Johnson bristles at any mention of parties and the political problems he faces back at Westminster. He is clearly irritated that it's taken the focus away from his efforts to deepen Britain's ties with this surging economy. But it's where the party saga goes next that could determine Boris Johnson's future as he returns to domestic political strife. Ben Wright, BBC News, Delhi.
A man has been declared an official suspect in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann nearly 15 years ago. She went missing during a family holiday in Praia da Luz in Portugal in May 2007, shortly before her 4th birthday. Her parents say they welcome today's development and that they haven't given up hope Madeleine may still be alive. Our correspondent John Kay has more from Praia da Luz.
Her face and name are known around the world. But what happened to Madeleine remains a mystery. It was on the 3rd of May 2007 that she vanished from the McCann's holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, the moment her family's lives changed forever.
Please give our little girl back.
Overnight, Portuguese prosecutors announced that they declared a new arguido, or formal suspect, in the case. It's understood to be this man, Christian Bruckner. The 45-year-old is currently in prison in Germany for rape and drugs offences. He's known to have been living in Portugal around the time Madeleine disappeared, and German investigators say mobile phone records place him in Praia da Luz. But he has denied any involvement in the McCann case and has not been charged.
You know, you have proximity, you have opportunity, and you have a profile with regards to an offender that absolutely fits in a way that no others have.
The last decade and a half have seen many potential breakthroughs come and go. Madeleine disappeared from her family's apartment while her parents were dining at a restaurant in the complex. And in the early days of the investigation, the Portuguese authorities made Kate and Gerry McCann official suspects, but that status was later withdrawn. In July 2013, the UK's Metropolitan Police reviewed the case, saying they had new witnesses and new evidence, and they searched areas close to where Madeleine was last seen. It was in June 2020 that German police said they'd identified a prisoner as a suspect, and the timing of Christian Bruckner now being made an arguido appears significant. Next month, it'll be 15 years since Madeleine was reported missing. And under Portuguese law, it's not possible for someone to be given arguido status after 15 years. But the authorities here say the move was not driven by timing, but by what they call strong indications of the practice of a crime.
Well, here in the resort of Praia da Luz tonight, people are asking what will happen now. Will the authorities travel from Portugal to Germany to interview this man in prison, or might they try to bring him here for questioning? Meanwhile, as we approach that 15th anniversary, Madeleine's parents, Kate and Gerry, have issued this statement tonight saying they cautiously welcome today's development. And they say they still have hope that Madeleine might still be alive. And they say one day they hope they will be reunited with her. Clive.
John, thank you. John Kay there, live in Portugal. The final day's campaigning is nearly over in France's presidential election, with voters going to the polls on Sunday. The choice is between the incumbent, Emmanuel Macron, and Marine Le Pen. Millions are still thought to be undecided. With the very latest, my colleague Rita Chakrabarti is live in Paris for us tonight. Rita.
Clive, thank you. Yes, well, here in Paris, as across the country, there is a fear that antipathy towards both candidates is the one thing that unites voters. But when people go to the polls this Sunday, they'll be voting for very similar issues to those that we are facing at home, namely the cost of living crisis and Ukraine. Emmanuel Macron is having to defend his record of 5 years in government, and it's been patchy. While Marine Le Pen, although she's worked hard to soften her image, is viewed by many as extreme and far right. And her proposal to ban Muslim women from wearing the headscarf in public places is particularly controversial. Our correspondent Lucy Williamson has been following the candidates on their last days on the campaign trail.
It's a bit late for tips on how to land a punch on his opponent. After 5 divisive years in power, what Emmanuel Macron needs is to persuade voters who'd quite like to punch him to give him their vote instead. Florentine and Chloe are both teachers here in the suburbs of Paris. They voted for Mr. Macron last time. Now they've come to give him a hard time.
Le Pen is just huge disaster. But Macron is still a disaster, I think, for school and for the service public, for public service in France. He's killing that step by step.
Florentine says she'll abstain on Sunday rather than vote for Macron again.
I'm still hesitating. I think if I do it, I might really get sick just after. He's a good talker. He knows how to try to seduce people, but we're not stupid.
Chloe gets close enough to shout her question on teachers' pay. Do you think teachers are lazy? She asks. Through the scrum, Macron grips her hand and locks in her vote.
He gripped my hand and said, "We're going to do something about that, I promise. So I will vote for him, but I want something in return."
There's a real choice on Sunday about where France is heading. Marine Le Pen is promising huge tax cuts and to take back control. Emmanuel Macron wants a global nation set on economic reform. Divisions here are deepening with every election cycle, and voters are now split between two radically different views of the world, with one candidate presenting herself as the spokeswoman of the people and the other saying he's protecting France from her. Dylan says he voted far left in the first round of this election. On Sunday, he's voting far right.
It's not that I like the idea of voting for Marine Le Pen, but we have to choose between the two. And when you're choosing between cholera and the plague, you choose the lesser of two evils.
At her final rally here in Arras, Marine Le Pen said voters should choose her to block Mr Macron. Both say the other is dangerous. Both sparked loyalty in their own fans and loathing in those of their rival. But most voters belong to neither camp. And in this battle over France's future, they're being asked to choose a side. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
Well, our Europe editor Katya Adler joins me now. And Katya, we see there two competing visions of France, but also of its role on the world stage.
Dramatically different worldviews here, Rita. I mean, let's take the EU for starters. Emmanuel Macron is EU enthusiastic. I mean, he doesn't want a United States of Europe, but he's a passionate believer in the European project. Marine Le Pen is deeply Eurosceptic. She's backed away from the idea of taking France out of the EU, but Brussels worried if she becomes president, she'll try and destroy the bloc from within. And you could say, well, this is just one country out of 27. What does it matter? Well, it does, because France is the second largest economy in the EU. It has the biggest single military force in the EU as well. It's also a big player in NATO, and that matters now, particularly because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Marine Le Pen has historically close ties to Moscow. She wants to take France out of NATO's military command. That worries Europe. We've had the leaders of Spain, Portugal and Germany writing to a French newspaper saying French voters don't support Marine Le Pen, something similar from Ukraine's president as well. So the choice of French president has a huge impact here, but outside France too.
Katya, many thanks. Katya Adler there. Well, the race is far closer than it was 5 years ago. And the big question is, what will the 49% of voters who didn't support either candidate in the first round do in this election? Will they lend their vote to Macron or Le Pen, or will they say none of the above and just abstain? Well, we'll know on Sunday. That's it from me in Paris for now. Back to you in the studio, Clive.
Rita, thank you for that. Rita Chakrabarti there, live in Paris. A woman has been found guilty of gross negligence manslaughter following the death of her 7-year-old son. Hakeem Hussein was found dead in a garden in Birmingham in November 2017. He was severely asthmatic, and Coventry Crown Court was told he was left alone without his inhaler. Our Midlands correspondent Phil Mackey has that story.
Hakeem Hussein was a frail young boy who died because his mother cared more about getting her next fix than looking after him. Laura Heath smoked heroin and crack cocaine. Her addiction had spiralled out of control in the months before he died. She even used her son's inhaler as a makeshift crack pipe. They lived in squalor. Their lives were chaotic. On the night he lost his life, Hakeem had a severe asthma attack, went outside for some air, but collapsed and died. His mother couldn't help because she'd passed out after taking drugs. But later she wrote her dead son a letter in which she appeared to blame him for not waking her up.
The evidence showed that he was simply neglected. His mum prioritised her drug use over him.
Hakim wasn't just failed by his mother, but also by the agencies who were responsible for him. They'd had plenty of warnings over a period of 2 years that culminated in a meeting on a Friday afternoon at which a nurse said if he wasn't taken into care immediately, he would die. No action was taken. 36 hours later, his body was found here.
At the time, Birmingham Children's Services had already been rated inadequate for nearly a decade. 6 months after Hakim died, a new trust was appointed to take over, and inspections have shown improvements.
All of the agencies working together had not shared or sought from each other enough information. One of the things that would happen today that didn't happen then is that would have triggered an immediate response that afternoon.
A serious case review will be published soon. It's hoped that changes already made will minimise the risk of another case like Hakim's. Phil Mackey, BBC News, Birmingham.
Retail sales in the UK have fallen for the second consecutive month as the rising cost of living hits consumer spending. Sales were down 1.4% in March, a much larger drop than expected. Online sales also fell by almost 8% as consumers cut spending on non-essential items. And there was a big fall in demand for petrol and diesel. The cost of filling up an average family car with petrol now stands at almost £90, 32% higher than a year ago. In just under 2 weeks' time, voters in the English local elections will head to the polls with thousands of seats up for grabs. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth has been to Bury in Greater Manchester to find out what issues are at the forefront of voters' minds there.
Good afternoon, Mr. James.
Business is getting back to usual at this hair and beauty salon in Bury, but it's been a tough few years. And with the economy still feeling far from smooth, it's clear what's on many minds here ahead of next month's local elections.
I'd say the after effects of COVID and the lockdown, then the price increases and the national crisis that we're all in. I feel it's just this now is harder than the initial lockdown itself.
It's more the fact that if the salon can keep me employed and whether I'll keep my job, but that's the main thing really.
I have noticed a massive impact on my business. Just again with the uncertainty of it all.
So are they convinced anyone has the solutions?
I have no confidence in any particular politician at the moment. I think whichever way it goes, they'll all have a hard battle in trying to recover from the mess that's been made.
In Bury and across England, these local elections will be a crucial reflection of the public mood. At this independent coffee and vinyl shop, they're interested in who'll do best for the area.
Which party is going to help the business, which is going to drive more people into Bury, and what policies they've got around helping that, making sure that there's plenty of people on the streets.
It's clear people here care about local issues. After all, these elections will determine who runs local services. But the big picture counts too. For the Conservatives, this is a public verdict on gatherings in Downing Street and the government's response to the war in Ukraine and spiralling prices. For Labour, it's a question of whether people think they have any of the answers. The Lib Dems are trying to tap into frustration among voters to win support. There's much to play for. At Bury Croquet Club, there is anger at lockdown events in Westminster. Less obvious is what impact that might have.
I'm just appalled that anybody, in any position could think that it's right to actually have drinks at work, and I think it's going to take a lot to get the trust back, regardless of which party you tend to traditionally vote for.
Boris, yes, he's had his parties. Even though it's not right, I'm sure he's not been on his own.
Would those kind of things factor into how you'd vote locally?
I think locally it matters what's important to the candidates and how they're going to respond with the money they've got and how they're going to spend it locally.
With the Greens and a host of other parties pitching for votes, these are local elections with national consequences. They'll show which parties are on course and which might need to change. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Bury.
The world's most prestigious international art event, the Venice Biennale, opens tomorrow with Ukrainian works centre stage against the backdrop of war. Our culture editor Katie Razzle has that story.
Serene Venice has been shaken by world events. First, its international art show was delayed a year by COVID. Now that Biennale is taking place in the shadow of war. all of which means, unusually, the art world is focused on Ukraine. There's a new Damien Hirst for a show defending freedom. And works by Maria Primachenko, who's a symbol of the country's national identity. It's about showcasing Ukrainian culture. One artist depicts her husband and others who have joined the army, painted as reports of war crimes against civilians in the Kyiv suburb Bucha were revealed.
And I was even crying because of Bucha, and these canvases were laying on the floor, and I thought, okay, it's ironically connect, because of the flatness of the painting, it's connected to my tears.
Russia's pavilion is shut. The artists and curator behind this year's show pulled out when the invasion happened. The only thing to see was an anti-war protest by a Russian artist. He was surrounded by supporters and then swiftly by police. He's a sole voice of protest, but he does speak for many Russian artists. And this Russian pavilion is closed. And in a sense, those closed doors symbolise quite how isolated Russia is. But some Russian art is being shown at the Biennale, including tapestries by Zhenya Machneva.
It's screaming, it's crying. All of my feelings is here.
Zhenya opposes the war.
We should stop it. And every day I want that it stops, but it's hard to face that each day it's getting worse.
The Ukrainian pavilion is now centre stage in Venice. The artist behind this work, called The Fountain of Exhaustion, says it's important that his country is represented here because the Russians are attacking not just Ukraine, but its culture.
They want to level and demolish totally Ukrainian culture because it doesn't exist, because it's part of Russia. That's they're saying openly, and that the war is a punishment for them. And those who doesn't want to go and to understand that this is only part of Russia, they have to be physically eliminated.
So, whether it's photographs of mothers who've lost sons in the conflict or a 17th century icon, these works on show here now reflect a country, a culture that is fighting for its very survival. Katie Razzle, BBC News, Venice.
That's it. Now on BBC One. Time for the news where you are. Have a very good night.